The subject of today's video is nothing new. Reproducing the film look with digital footage is something that's done with all sorts of content from Instagram Reels all the way up to full-blown Hollywood films. I've recently been using a plugin called Dehancer to add a bit of a filmic look to my videos. I've been quite impressed with the results, so today I'd like to talk a little bit about that plugin and how I use it. Dehancer is not paying me to make this video, but there is a sponsor today, and that is Squarespace. Before we get started, it's important to note that I am not a color grading expert by any means, so take everything I have to say with a grain of salt. If you're looking to broaden your knowledge on the subject, I'd recommend watching videos by Dehancer. He is a legitimate professional colorist and has a ton of free resources available on his YouTube channel, which I will link in the description below. Dehancer is available for Resolve, After Effects in Premiere, and Final Cut Pro, and one of the things that makes it so great is how simple it is to use, primarily because of the color science and camera profiles that are built into the plugin. So if I wanted to do a super quick and simple grade on this Blackmagic 6K Pro clip, all I'd have to do is drag the Dehancer plugin onto a node, and then go up to my source, hit choose camera, select my camera, which is the 6K Pro using Gen 5 color science. And as you can see, we already have a pretty solid look, and we haven't even touched one of the other 18 modules that are available to us within Dehancer. I've spent hours playing around with Dehancer and building different node trees, trying to figure out which method works best for me, and what I've landed on is a bit of a hybrid between my traditional color grading and correcting workflow that I've used for the past 2 or 3 years now, which I've made a video about already. So if you want to check that out, there's a link in the description. And then combining that with a node tree that Dehancer recommends using. He has a great video about that specific node tree, so I'll leave that link in the description as well. And I've kind of fused these together to form this kind of longer node tree. It looks more daunting than it actually is. So let's dive into that and see how that works with my workflow. Now, if you do want to go the simple route and just add Dehancer to a single node, there are tools within the plugin that allow you to adjust your exposure, your temperature, your tint, contrast, saturation, those basic color adjustments. I just prefer to make those changes within the tools that are available to me in Resolve. All right, so this is the node tree. Again, it looks more daunting than it actually is. Essentially, I'm starting with a color space transform node that's going to bring the color space and gamma that my camera shoots at into the widest color space that we have available to work in, which is DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. So that's going to allow me to do all my color corrections in that very wide color space. So that's going to be all of these nodes here, everything from my exposure to my highlights and shadows to the color warper is going to be done within the DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate color space. And these inputs here are just based on what your camera shoots at. So for me with the Blackmagic 6K Pro, that's going to be Blackmagic Design Wide Gamut Gen 4 or 5, and then the gamut's going to be Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5, but this varies depending on what camera you're using. And then after my basic color adjustment nodes, I'm actually going to add the LUT that I always use to grade my video footage, which is a Sedona LUT. It's free. I'll leave a link to that in the description so you can download that. And then I set that to 50%. So not too overpowering, but it does add a bit of an extra amount of color and contrast to the footage. After this LUT, I'll add my last color space transform node, which is essentially taking this timeline color space that's DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate and converting it to Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4, which is our output color space in Gamma. And then after that second color space transform node, then I'm adding the Dehancer node at the very end of the timeline and having Dehancer read this footage as Rec 709, because that is what we are outputting here with this second color space transform node. So the first module that I'll use after the input module is the film tab here. And this is where the customization really starts to get crazy, because you can choose all of these different film profiles, and they have tons of them in here, everything from Cinestill to expired Ektar to just the typical Kodak motion picture film that you can shoot today. One thing that I found interesting is that it defaults to Kodak Vision 3 250D, which looks good, but then when you switch to Kodak Vision 3 50D, you lose a ton of contrast. And I've shot dozens and dozens of rolls of real 16mm and 8mm Kodak 50D and 250D, and there is not this much difference in contrast when you shoot those film stocks through an actual film camera. So I'm not sure why Kodak 250D seems to have a bit of an extra amount of contrast compared to a lot of these other film stocks, but I do actually end up using the Kodak Vision 3 250D film profile for 95% of the shots that I grade with Dehancer. So the next tab that I'll utilize is film compression, which essentially just retains a little bit more highlight information. If you have a clip that, has some brighter blown out highlights, you check this on and you can see up here in the sun, for example, we're retaining a little bit more highlight information there. So I don't use that on every shot, but if there's a brighter scene or something, I'll definitely flip this film compression tab on. All right, so the next tab is the print tab, and this is essentially emulating the process of printing a film that's meant to be shown through a projector. So if you look here, you have different film print profiles available, and Kodak 2383 is a real film print that's widely used in Hollywood. Movies that are still shown on 35mm film are typically printed on this Kodak 2383 print film. So that's pretty cool that there's some different profiles available for us to use within this print module. Now, as I mentioned, this Kodak 250D film profile has a bit of extra contrast already. So you can see if we add this Kodak 2383 print film, it's going to add even more contrast. So I typically will leave this set to linear, but if I end up using a film profile that isn't Kodak 250D, rather a film profile that has a little bit less contrast like Kodak 50D, for example, then I think it makes sense to come down here and flick on this Kodak 2383 print film profile to give you a little bit of extra punch, a little bit of extra contrast. But that's totally a personal preference thing. Some people might like that really punchy look, and so if you end up using Kodak 250D and want to throw this print film on, I can totally see the desire to do that. And sometimes I will do that if I think that, it makes sense for that scene to be a little bit more on the contrasty side. But here's a little side-by-side so you can see the difference. Here's the Kodak 250D film profile with just the linear print profile. And then here's a Kodak 50D film profile with the Kodak 2383 print film enabled. And then the last tab that I'll utilize is the infamous film grain tab. This is the kind of classic characteristic that I think a lot of people seek when they're trying to emulate film with digital footage, is that film grain. I don't think you can 100% get there digitally, but Dehancer does do a pretty damn good job emulating film grain, and they have different profiles available, everything from 8mm 50 ISO all the way up to 65mm 500 ISO film. Now, I don't like my film grain to be overbearing and distracting, so I typically will do 35mm 50 ISO or 65mm 500 ISO, kind of play around with those two settings and see what I like best. Whichever one I end up selecting, I'll usually select that and then go into the custom section here and just bring it down a little bit in the highlights, because film grain really tends to show up in the highlights. So I don't want that to be too distracting, so I'll typically leave that highlight slider toned down just a little bit so that it's not too overwhelming. As you can see, there's a lot more effects available within Dehancer. You got halation, bloom, film damage, gate weave, overscanning effects. I typically just like my footage to be a little bit more on the subtle side. I think you start adding all of these effects and it can be distracting to the actual video and story you're trying to tell, which is why I've just shown today the tabs that I do utilize. So once my Dehancer node is all dialed in with my film profile and my print profile and kind of that grainy look that I want to achieve, then I'll go back into my traditional nodes here and make any other color adjustments that I need to, like adjusting my exposure or saturation. I'll just go ahead and do that in the primaries wheel or the HDR wheel within Resolve itself. I use the Blackmagic 6K Pro for the majority of my videos, but let's say I want to build this node tree out with footage that I've shot on my Sony a7 IV. It's the exact same process. All you change is the input color space and input gamut in this first color space transform node. So for the Sony, my input color space would be Sony S Gamut 3 Cine, and then my input gamut would be Sony S-Log 3. And now everything else can stay the exact same because Dehancer is reading this footage as Rec 709 footage, which is what we've converted it to with this second color space transform node. We're eating raw chilies in Thailand. This only ends one way. That's instant. That is instant. Dehancer also has an iOS app, so you can mess around with film profiles on videos and photos that you've shot with your phone, but it costs $400, I believe, for lifetime access, which in my opinion is completely ridiculous. The app should definitely be free, but it is available if you're interested. I will leave a link to all relevant resources that I mentioned in this video in the description below. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment. And lastly, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is the best in the business when it comes to building a new website. Whether you're a photographer, artist, musician, or starting a new business, Squarespace has all the tools you need to get a professional website up and running. I recently hosted an entire online photography gallery that featured 100 photographers from around the world on my personal website, and that's all thanks to Squarespace. The website building interface is extremely intuitive and absolutely zero coding is necessary. They have a ton of fantastic templates to choose from, and from there you can begin to further customize the look and feel of your site to make it unique to you. On top of that, they have great e-commerce tools that let you keep track of orders, inventory, customers, offer memberships, and more. And with fantastic customer service, you're always in the clear if you ever need help along the way. If you'd like to receive 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain, head over to squarespace.com/Bray or use code BRAY at checkout to do so.